Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from around the world. My name is John Allen, and I'm the president of the Brookings Institution. It's a great pleasure to welcome you today to our first day of the week-long conference entitled The Middle East and the New U.S. Administration. Today's conference marks the successful conclusion of the first year of the Center for Middle East Policy's project on sources of Middle East instability, a wide-ranging project that is central to the center's mission of, quote, chart the path, political, economic, and social, to a Middle East at peace with itself and with the world. I'd like to take this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude to Anne and Andrew Tisch for their support of this project. They are treasured friends and valuable partners and thought partners for the institution. Without their generous support and steadfast commitment to Brookings' core values of independence, which allows our scholars complete discretion in their work and studies, our Center for Middle East Policy would not be able to produce its array of research and analysis year-round, let alone for this week's conference. Finally, as someone who has personally spent a lot of time in the Middle East, both in and out of uniform, I cannot express enough how timely today's conference is, especially as President Biden continues to navigate his first 100 days in office. I'm confident that our excellent series of speakers and panels that will help articulate not only the present state of affairs in this region, but the future of America's role in it. So with that, let me turn the floor over to our director of the Center for Middle East Policy, Natan Sachs, who will be providing further information on this week's programming, as well as to introduce our first panel. Natan, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Natan Sachs. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Policy. We're delighted that so many of you have joined us from around the world. This week will feature 4 days of public discussions, today and then Wednesday through Friday, with leaders and experts from the Middle East and North Africa, the United States, and around the world. Headlining our series are two heads of state, the President of Iraq, His Excellency Barham Saleh, who will join us for a conversation on Wednesday, and His Majesty King Abdullah II of Jordan, from whom we'll hear in recorded remarks on Thursday. Among our distinguished guests are also ministers, former ministers, and ambassadors from Morocco, Algeria, the United Arab Emirates, the Palestinian Authority, Jordan, the United Kingdom, Germany, and later this morning, Israel. We will also hear from American voices, including the new chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress on Wednesday, our speakers in this first panel this morning, and many others. I recommend tuning in for all these events, but also highly recommend hearing from some of the brightest experts on issues ranging from water security to US policy on Iran to ongoing conflicts and their aftermath in Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere. We're delighted to host such an array of distinguished leaders, seasoned experts, and new voices to Washington on one virtual stage. All our meetings will be in the mornings, Washington time, to allow for audiences both in the United States and in the region to join in. You can see the full agenda on our website at brookings.edu, and you can join the conversation and submit questions for panelists via Twitter using the hashtag US Middle East. Naturally, given the limited time, we will not cover nearly all the topics we would have liked to, nor from all angles. There are important countries and issues we plan to address in future convenings and research. I invite you to join us for our events throughout the year, and especially to read the excellent research of my colleagues from across the foreign policy program and across Brookings in general. I'd like to join John Allen in expressing my thanks to Anne and Andrew Tisch for their support for the Center's core project. This conference, as John said, celebrates the successful first year of this flagship project, and we look forward to many more. This series and our work would not be possible without their dedication to in-depth research and to widening the aperture of policy regarding the region. My thanks also to all my colleagues who helped put this program together, including especially the colleagues who will remain behind the scenes, keeping our event going. In just a moment, we will have our first panel from an American perspective on US policy priorities in the Middle East. You can see the full bios of all our speakers on our website. So in the interest of time, we will only offer brief introductions during the panels. Our speakers on this panel will be Congressman Will Hurd, who represented the 23rd District of Texas until this year and served on the House Intelligence Committee. He focused a lot of energy on artificial intelligence and cybersecurity in particular. Previously, he was an undercover CIA agent and officer overseas as well as in the US, so he comes with multiple valuable perspectives. We'll also hear from Dr. Megan O'Sullivan, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. Previously, Dr. O'Sullivan served in the White House as Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan under President George W. Bush. She's also a Brookings alumna. Rounding out our panel is my colleague, Dr. Suzanne Maloney. She's Vice President for Foreign Policy here at Brookings. Suzanne has advised Democratic and Republican administrations on Iran policy and served as a member of the State Department's policy planning staff. Our moderator will be Brookings President John Allen, who was a retired four-star Marine Corps general. His commands included extensive time in Iraq and as commander of all NATO and US forces in Afghanistan. He subsequently led the security dialogue for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and as President Barack Obama's special presidential envoy to the global coalition to counter ISIL. Thank you again for joining us. And without further ado, I'll turn the virtual floor back over to John.
Natan, thank you for those great comments and warm introductions to our dear friends. Congressman Hurd, Dr. O'Sullivan, it's great to have you back at Brookings, and Suzanne Maloney, our Brookings Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program. It's wonderful to have you all with us today, and I have a series of questions. We'll go till about 40 minutes past the hour. And let me ask the first question, turning straight to that. It's for the whole panel, and we'll go first to Megan, and then to Will, and then to Suzanne. Now, the Middle East has long been a central focus of American foreign policy, but much has changed in the region over the last decade since the so-called Arab Spring and all the turmoil that followed. And we have experienced significant, not turmoil necessarily, but significant change in the United States with respect to our views on the Middle East. So to start, let me again ask you all, please, to give us your sense, to look out across the Middle East and North Africa in early 2021. And what do you identify as America's top priorities now, please?
Thank you. And it's great to be back here with Brookings and great to be here with some good friends and people whose views I really respect on this and many other issues. I think let me just begin by where you started, is just, is the Middle East actually a priority for the United States, for the Biden administration? And I think that many analysts there impulsive responses, no, it's not going to be a high priority for the Biden administration. And I think it's clear that there's an imperative now for the Biden administration to focus on events at home, to focus on getting the coronavirus under wraps, and really to focus on developments in Asia. I think there's a clear consensus among the foreign policy community. That's where the largest imperatives lie, along with transnational threats, be it climate or pandemics or other issues. So I think it's clear that the Biden administration hopes to have a more modest Middle East agenda or policy than its previous or its predecessors, the Obama administration, the Bush administration. But I think even if we look at a more modest approach in the Middle East, it's still going to be quite a challenging set of items in the inbox. There's a lot of issues. I know we'll touch on some of them. I'll just list a couple that I think are going to be the high priorities, but others here can expound on them even more explicitly. First, and as I think is quite clear from the early weeks of the Biden administration, is this recalibrating the relationship with Iran, most specifically curbing its nuclear ambitions. Suzanne is really my go-to person on that, so I won't say anything more about that. Secondly, I would say actually building on the Abraham Accords that the Trump administration helped birth really has resulted in a fundamental change in the region, and a positive one from the perspective of American interests. Third, I would mention just the relationship with Saudi Arabia. This is also clear from the outset. It was clear from the campaign that the Biden administration wanted to recalibrate its relationship with Saudi Arabia, not sever it by any stretch of the imagination, but to reintegrate human rights into that relationship, and to really put an increased focus on Yemen, as we saw in some of the early announcements and the appointment of Tim Lenderking as the special envoy for Yemen. I'd be remiss if not mentioning Afghanistan and Iraq, because I do think, although there's a lot of fatigue around those issues, that, particularly on Afghanistan, this is a moment where if the Biden administration doesn't devote some calories to this issue, it is on track to really go down the drain and to come back and bite the United States again. And so I think that is going to demand some focus. And Iraq is, is a country that fortunately isn't in our headlines as much as it used to be, but still there's some fragility that the United States needs to pay attention to in order to stave off more challenging problems down the road.
Terrific answer, and I love your priorities. In particular, some calorie dedication to Afghanistan. We've got to do that. Will, your thoughts, please.
Sure. I'm currently teaching a class at University of Chicago, and I'm trying to be like Dr. O'Sullivan, right? One of the things I'm talking about how politics is getting in the way in national security strategy, which requires me to talk to the students about what is our national security strategy. And when you look back, even going all the way back to Ronald Reagan, our objectives have been roughly the same. But sometimes we don't always clearly articulate that. And number one is to prevent catastrophic attack against the U.S. homeland and to protect our citizens abroad. We must remember that. It also is about avoiding a global economic crisis. We talk about stopping the proliferation of WMD, preventing infectious diseases from growing. Okay, we've not done a very good job on that. And then limit the consequences of failing states. And also dealing with climate change, but also energy independence at the same time. So how do those things translate in the various areas around the world? And then how does that translate specifically in the Middle East? And so that means you have to deal with Afghanistan and Iraq. We can't ignore them. These are things that we shouldn't have arbitrary timelines on getting out of. And I'm sure we can get deeper into those conversations. The conversations with our Sunni Arab partners is going to be driven by the issue of Iran, and I'm sure we're going to have a large debate on that. I don't believe you can trust the Iranians, and seeking a deal just for a deal's sake is the wrong way to go. And this is one area that I think we have to be steadfast. But a broader issue here that hasn't gotten enough conversation is the dynamic between us and China and working with our allies. Some of our great partners in the Middle East are saying, don't make us choose between the US and China, because they're implying we're probably not going to like what the answer may be. And so part of what we forget is, what is our economic national security strategy in these areas? Why don't we have a more robust plan on how to address this? OPIC is doing their thing, or whatever the new name of OPIC is. USAID is doing their thing. John, you know better than anybody, we have a clear national defense strategy. Dr. O'Sullivan can talk about how the national security strategy has been developed, but our economic national security strategy, we need to have one, and it needs to be robust in order to counter the One Belt, One Road initiative of the Chinese, because we're not going to like the consequences. And if one of our natural interests is the growth of freedom throughout the world, this means we got to make sure that we're developing technologies and exporting technologies that, especially around artificial intelligence, that apply to the ethics that is supportive of freedom, not the ethics driven by a totalitarian regime like the Chinese. So those are some of the things that I think we're going to have to deal with, and it's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds.
Thank you, Will. Terrific comments on China. And who would have ever thought that in the Middle East, as opposed to East Asia, our friends and allies would be saying, don't make us choose about China. But that's where we are today. Suzanne, please.
Thanks so much, John. And I want to thank all of you for joining us here today, and especially to my two co-panelists who've really done a masterful job, I think, in outlining the core priorities for the United States in the Middle East. I couldn't improve upon it, but let me just add a couple of points of perhaps nuance. One is to point out that, despite the fact that the Biden administration does appear determined not to get dragged into the Middle East, as I think there was an anonymous quote in today's Politico suggesting the Middle East has a way of dragging us in. What happens in the region rarely stays in the region. And so I think it's highly unlikely that we're going to be able to simply wash our hands of the region. Beyond that, I think we have historic obligations. We have a legacy that is, in fact, if you stretch back the century plus of U.S. engagement with the countries and peoples of the Middle East, is in fact quite a positive one. And we have been seen as a source of important values and important independence. And that, I think, is unchanging despite the increased frictions that have evolved in the post 9/11 era. We are now in a different era. I think with the eruption of the pandemic and the shift in terms of U.S. priorities, as the Biden administration has articulated, there are core interests that they must attend to regarding the efforts to try to prevent the next pandemic, to deal with the economic recession around the world that has been provoked by these circumstances, the climate crisis, racial justice at home. This is going to be an administration that is going to focus on the domestic home front. But that doesn't mean we simply walk away from those commitments, from the record of service that we have to the region. And it doesn't mean that we can simply abandon our interests and efforts across the broader Middle East. And so both Megan and Will have cited Iran, have cited Saudi Arabia as core policy interests for the administration. Like them, I hope that the administration will continue to focus on conflict resolution and good governance in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And I do hope that we will also think about the great power competition that we're experiencing, not just with China, but also importantly with Russia, which has emerged, I think, as the most salient outside power in the Middle East, and one whose interests and objectives there are in no way, I think, consistent with American values or with the peace and prosperity that the peoples of the Middle East hunger for.
Thank you, Suzanne. Let me come to Megan to follow up on comments that both Will and Suzanne have made. And it's the great power competition that we see with Russia and China and the United States. And as this administration seeks to create a policy about great power competition in the region, do you have a view on that?
Sure, and I'm very glad that both Suzanne and Congressman Hurd mentioned this, because I do think this is a new dynamic and one that really should shape the lens through which we view the Middle East. I think some analysts or observers might say, well, with a focus on great power competition, maybe this means the Middle East kind of gets less attention. I actually think the opposite argument is even more compelling, because basically we know the Middle East has a lot of overt conflicts, a lot of latent conflicts, and all of those present opportunities for China, Russia, and others to get involved to project power. So I think the risks of domestic or internal to the region conflicts being internationalized are greater than they've ever been, and that plays into the great power competition. I also think there's the reality that although we may like to think that what we do in Afghanistan or other places in the Middle East doesn't affect how the rest of the world looks at us, it's certainly just not the case. Our, reputation for credibility and reliability as a partner and as a great power really is, it's global. So if we look at the red line case back in the Obama administration, the failure to kind of make good on setting a red line, the use of WMD in Syria against the Assad regime, the failure to hold Assad accountable for that actually reverberated throughout the world. It certainly made an impact on our Asian allies and others. So I think we have to keep that in mind. So really what it comes down to, I think, is some really big questions about when we look at our approach to the Middle East, what is the new way in which we frame and view our objectives and our, the tasks that we hold ourselves accountable to? And I think, if we look at it through the lens of great power competition, it really does underscore some of our ongoing missions. It basically means things like protecting, sea lanes actually becomes even more important, and establishing and maintaining our naval primacy in the Gulf becomes even more important in the context of great power competition, as well as keeping Russia and China from becoming really the diplomatic power brokers like we've seen in Syria. We don't want to see that replicated throughout the region. So there's a whole host of things we could talk about, but I just would underscore how the Middle East could be really a central landscape for this great power competition unfolding.
Well, that was a very important point you made about dominating sea lines of communications. And our Navy has done that for many, many years. And it's not just the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. It's also the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb, which is an extraordinarily important choke point as well. And Will, your comment about artificial intelligence, as we know, these technologies, when they're applied, are a reflection of the values of those countries. Here's a chance, as we continue the process of America advocating on behalf of artificial intelligence and emerging technologies, to have those be reflective of our national values, as opposed to how the Chinese typically apply them. If I could, let me come back to Dr. O'Sullivan. President Biden has elevated the issue of climate, appointing Secretary John Kerry to be the climate envoy, and he promises an aggressive whole of government approach to tackle the climate crisis. Now, meanwhile, you've written about the abundance of new energy supplies and how that has left the United States less reliant on Middle East oil and gas. So let me ask, please, what will this combination of an aggressive approach to the climate crisis and lessened reliance on imported energy, what will that mean for the U.S. relationship with the region?
Sure. Let me just, again, I don't want to dominate this here, but let me just put kind of this in two baskets. First is, is the quality and the nature of American diplomacy going to change now that climate is going to be a central pillar of American foreign policy? So not just towards the Middle East, but in the rest of the world. And I'd say if the Biden administration is successful in making climate a central pillar, we are going to see a very different kind of American foreign policy. It used to be that climate was an issue. There were climate specialists. They engaged, concertedly in climate fora and climate dialogues. But now we're talking about every American diplomat in general being a climate advocate, talking about decarbonization, integrating it into the highest level meetings. This is going to be a change in the nature of American diplomacy, and it is undoubtedly going to need to squeeze out other priorities if the Biden administration makes good on this pledge. The broader question about what does this elevation of climate change mean for the Middle East? And I think a lot of people might think, well, it means the Middle East is less important. The world's moving away from fossil fuels. America already was just on the cusp of really reaching, meeting its own net oil needs right before the pandemic. I actually think it's a lot more complex than that. The Middle East will demand attention in this climate agenda because there are so many players there that actually have the potential to be spoilers in executing this agenda, in bringing down the price of oil, making it much harder for other alternative sources of energy to be competitive. So that's one factor. And I think this is going to require engagement by the Biden administration with countries of the Middle East on climate. And to be fair to these countries, many of them, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, have demonstrated a real interest in actually working on climate. The UAE is actually debating whether it should adopt a net carbon neutral target, as many other countries have in the world. So these are not countries that are not seriously thinking about this. And the last point I'll make is this question of, I think too many people feel that moving in the right direction on climate means that the world will no longer use oil. If you look at scenarios, energy scenarios that are climate compatible across the board, from the International Renewable Energy Agency to the International Energy Agency in Paris, you will see that all of these scenarios incorporate not as much oil as we're using today, but a significant amount. And what that means for the Middle East is that the Middle East is going to be more important in the world's energy consumption as it relates to oil, because we'll be using less oil and we'll be using it with carbon capture technologies, ideally. But more of the oil we use will come from the Middle East. Less of it will come from all these other countries that are higher cost producers. So the Middle East will continue to be important when it comes to energy. Sorry to go on so long, but there are many complexities I wanted to tease out.
That last point is really important, and I think would be lost on most observers of this debate and this conversation. So thank you for raising that. Suzanne, let me turn to you, please. This is about Iran. The Trump administration left the 2015 JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated to contain Iran's nuclear program, and pursued a policy of maximum pressure on Iran. You've, of course, been a great student of that and very vocal on these subjects. Last week, the Biden administration agreed to meet with Iranian counterparts to discuss steps which would bring both sides back into compliance with the JCPOA. And of course, we wake up this morning to hear that the administration is actually talking to the Iranians on the hostage issue, which is a very important issue as well. So my question is that the right approach? Should Washington, with respect to the JCPOA, seek to move back to the original deal as quickly as possible, or should the administration seek to use the current impasse over the deal to negotiate a, quote, longer and stronger deal, as Secretary Blinken promised in his confirmation testimony? A lot there, sorry.
No, that's a terrific and very important question. And I appreciate you getting right to the heart of the matter, which is, which direction do we go? This is the subject, of course, of a lot of debate around Washington and around the world. I want to take one step back, though. I think let's think about what our real goal is here. There are many, and especially around this debate about what kind of deal are we seeking and how do we seek it, who focus on the deal as the document as being the objective of U.S. policy. I think that's the wrong lens. I think the appropriate lens is how do we best deter Iran from making further advances on a pathway to nuclear weapons capability, and how do we best deter other policies that Iran undertakes that are deeply destabilizing to the region and deeply threatening to its own population and to U.S. interests and allies and partners around the world. What's the best way to go about that? Obviously, diplomacy has to be at the core of what we do. And so in that respect, I think it's quite positive that the Biden administration has indicated its willingness to talk to the Iranians. That has been a staple of U.S. policy since the 1979 revolution, with only brief and relatively unsuccessful exceptions. So diplomacy has to be key and core to the way that we approach this problem, rather than trying to predetermine the outcome of a JCPOA return versus a longer or stronger deal. What we need is a policy that is aimed at getting a longer and stronger array of deterrents to Iran's most objectionable behaviors. I want to put a little bit of emphasis on the question of urgency. The Iranians, of course, have set a deadline for removing their implementation of the additional protocol, which enables snap inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is a tool by the Iranians to try to push the Biden administration into a suboptimal return to some kind of an agreement with them. I think that the administration is rightly resisting it, and I hope that they continue. We need to avoid the Iranians using brinksmanship to try to force some kind of outcome upon the world, which enables them to move closer to, enables the regime to move closer to its own objectives, rather than ensuring that we're undertaking diplomacy that is carefully thought through. The final point I want to make is that Iran is not just a nuclear issue, as I've suggested. There are real issues of concern about the way Iran conducts itself around the region. We talked a little bit about the conflicts in the early set of discussions that we've had this morning, the conflicts that have roiled the Middle East. Whether it's Syria or Yemen, Iran has played an integral role in fueling violence that has not just destabilized those countries, not just led to humanitarian catastrophes, but obviously had implications for Europe and the wider world with the flow of refugees that has left those countries and others because, in part, of Iran's destabilizing activities. We also know that Iran's treatment of its own population is of real and deep concern. And as you noted, John, the proclivity to take hostages as a way of trying to gain leverage with the international community is a uniquely horrific aspect of Iranian policy, again, that has lasted now for more than 4 decades. So while I would favor a longer and stronger deal, I think our goal now should be diplomacy with Iran to try to deter its worst behaviors, that we should undertake it in a way that has proven most successful, that is in close coordination with allies and partners around the world. And that policy shouldn't just be focused on the nuclear issue, it has to be focused on the broad array of concerns about Iran.
Excellent. That comprehensive approach is definitely the way to go. Will, let me come to you, please. This is also a time when American domestic politics has grown increasingly partisan and in many ways just toxic. It's often used to be said that the politics stop at the water's edge. But we see that the dramatic foreign policy shifts between administrations have unfortunately made the partisan rancor in our government today far more difficult for presidents to negotiate and to navigate through. We've seen this president return to the Paris Climate Accord. We've seen this president talk about another conversation with Iran. But as we go forward, as we seek to increase the sense of reliability of the United States with our allies, how should we be thinking about partisanship at home as it affects our ability to secure our interests abroad?
You know, I think General Mattis, I think it was in 2017, he was testifying in front of Congress, and he said, you know, in essence, I'm messing up his quote, that comedy in Congress would be the equivalent of like 10 battleships in the military. And look, this concern that our allies and even our enemies have about the unreliability of the United States of America is driven because foreign policy shouldn't be done by executive order, right? Now, as you said, John, it had to because you can't get agreements within Congress. One of the things I'm excited about this year is Greg Meeks and Mike McCall. These are two great members of Congress, both incredibly smart, great understanding of the issues around the world, and you're probably going to see them be the most bipartisan committee. And so I hope everybody starts following their lead, and I'm looking forward to what Greg has to say later today, I believe, as part of this presentation. But ultimately, Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and we need to make sure that the executive branch is engaging with the senior leaders of Congress on these important issues. I also think one of the problems that we have is that we need to strengthen our diplomatic corps. I think starting since Bill Clinton, a lot of decisions were being made at the White House when we should have our ambassadors on the ground making some of those decisions. And if you strengthen the ability of the president's representative on the ground to get things done, I think that's going to help individual members of Congress look at a particular expert on the ground. Ryan Crocker always said that if you had more wingtips and pumps on the ground, meaning more diplomats and intelligence officers, you can prevent boots on the ground. I'm a firm believer in that. And so while that may sound disconnected, that strengthening the diplomatic corps is going to improve Congress working together, but it allows members of Congress to see an outside person that is the expert on the region rather than someone who's pushing a political agenda. Now, but it's going to be hard, and ultimately it's a structural problem within our system. When 92% of elections are decided in primaries versus general elections, you're going to talk to the more extreme side. But nothing big has ever been done in the United States of America for a lasting amount of time unless it was done together. And so I hope we're going to see a move back to that. I hope the Joe Biden, who was the deal maker in the Senate, is the kind of a president we see. I think he's making those efforts, but that may require him to go beyond the leadership of both houses and work with rank and file members on a lot of these issues that we're talking about here today, which there's a number of members that care about these things.
Well, that's a great answer. And I know that this administration, and I know there's great interest within the Congress as well in a bipartisan way to work together to try to link our domestic policy agenda with our foreign policy agenda. And you made a very important point. We do not thank our foreign service and our aid professionals, our USAID professionals, our development professionals. We do not thank them enough because they are in so many ways the leading edge of American influence. Mm-hmm. You talked about battleships, aircraft carriers, divisions of troops, those are important. But in the end, the leading edge of America's influence in the world is our foreign service and our development professionals. And we just don't thank them enough. And thank you for making that linkage and raising it.
Yeah, and John, let me add on that. We need them to be engaging in these international organizations, right? Right. It's not just about participating in these international organizations. It's about leading in these international organizations. When I was posted to India, it was when President Bush was redefining that bilateral relationship, and we were getting ready to make some major announcements. And at the UN, they were still talking about being part of the non-aligned movement and banging us over the head. And we were like, oh, we're going to let that go because we know in the bilateral relationship it's okay. Some of that mentality needs to stop, and we need to actually take active roles in these organizations, because what are the Chinese doing in these international settings, these international rule setting bodies? Now they're driving it to their benefit, and so if we have a strong diplomatic corps, it's going to help us, and our allies, especially in the Middle East, are going to see that as us reasserting our role in this global order.
You couldn't be more right, and our re-emphasis now on the UN, rejoining the World Health Organization, rejoining the Human Rights Council, all of those things are opportunities, as you say, properly will, for us to exert leadership, the kind of leadership that the world really needs. Dr. O'Sullivan, Megan, let me come back to you, please, for this question. We saw an early glimpse of the new administration's approach to the Middle East. when President Biden announced the end of U.S. support for offensive operations in the Saudi-led conflict in Yemen. Could you talk, please, to what role the U.S. can play in resolving this conflict, which has produced, frankly, one of the world's worst humanitarian crises? In Washington, is Washington engaged in a reset with Saudi Arabia? And what will this mean in practice if, in fact, it is?
Great, thank you. I'd like to just say one word on building on Congressman Hurd's really good comments about the domestic considerations going into foreign policy. I think we should also acknowledge that the Biden administration has been very explicit about trying to reconnect the domestic audience with the foreign policy of the United States. So we've heard the phrase foreign policy for the middle class. I think we're still all trying to figure out what that means, but clearly there's a real need to explain to Americans why our engagement overseas benefits them at home. And I think that underscores and will underscore a lot of the efforts that the Biden administration will do in the future. And I think that is constructive to really try harder to make that explicit linkage. On Saudi Arabia, I don't know if I'd use the word reset, but maybe it's appropriate. I think that it's clear that the Biden administration wants to, as I used the word, to recalibrate its relationship with the Saudis, and it's announced that it's kind of undertaken a review of this relationship, took a few first steps in moving in that direction. Then candidate Biden used some very harsh rhetoric towards the Saudis during the campaign, saying that we're going to treat Saudi Arabia like the pariah state that it is, and that's a quote. I think the reality is going to be less harsh. I think this is at heart a team that is pragmatic in nature, and it knows that it needs Saudi Arabia to be a more constructive actor in the region. And the way to get that to happen is not by insulating or isolating Saudi Arabia from the United States. I also think that we're going to see, and we already have begun to see, that the Saudis are very sensitive to this. I think they enjoyed their relationship with the Trump administration. They knew they benefited from this very special relationship where their internal dynamics pretty much went unquestioned, and they had extraordinary access to the powers that be, and in the White House in particular. But they knew that that was an unusual situation, and they knew that another administration was going to handle them a bit differently. And we've seen, just initial things that the Saudis have done have indicated that they're looking for a way to engage with the U.S. more, to be perceived as a more positive player in the region. We saw the release of a very prominent human rights activist in the early days of the Biden administration. That clearly was a signal to the Biden administration. We hear you. We're interested in listening and working with you. But I do think it is going to be different. I think that Saudi Arabia is going to be more of part of the regional landscape than a unique and precious relationship on its own. In terms of Yemen, I do think that the United States has an important role to play there. I wouldn't necessarily say it's in the power of the United States to solve this problem per se, but I think influencing Saudi Arabia's behavior is real, and these decisions not to sell offensive weaponry, I think, are important and will get the Saudis' attention and make them kind of recalibrate, just exactly how they're going to move forward in this conflict. But I think I was really pleased, as I mentioned before, that announcement was coupled with the appointment of someone who really knows the region as well. Tim Lenderking has lived and worked in Saudi Arabia and in the region as a whole. I've known him in that context for a long time, and someone who will be exclusively really dedicated to trying to find a diplomatic effort that is more fruitful with Yemen. So I think that's a really positive development. And in the very short term, I think the Biden administration has taken some steps to acknowledge that the humanitarian crisis needs to be forefront on the global agenda. So delisting the Houthis has made it more possible for humanitarian aid to flow. And I think that has to be very, very high in the list of priorities when it comes to Yemen policy or policy towards the Arabian Peninsula.
Great answer. That delisting of the Houthis was a very interesting move by the administration, actually. Let's turn now to some audience questions. Megan, you mentioned the advent of the Abraham Accords, and I think those of us who've watched the region for a long time never believed that we'd ever see something like this. And it's a very positive development on the whole. But it has created a dynamic about the two-state solution and the future of Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. Let me start with you, Megan, if I may, and then go to Will and Suzanne, if you've got thoughts on that, please.
Sure. As I mentioned, I do think the Abraham Accords are a very significant development, but I think they're still holding out a lot of promise, and a lot of promise that is yet to be realized. So we can't kind of assume that these dynamics are going to continue and unfold in a positive direction without real encouragement. It certainly has been good for many actors, but the Palestinians is not among these, as it has really indicated to the Palestinians and to others that Israelis and Arabs can move forward positively in their relationship without addressing the Palestinian issue. So I think it has really put the Palestinian issue more on the back burner. I think that is appropriate for the moment, in the sense that I think before engaging on some additional diplomatic efforts to resolve the issue between the Israelis and the Palestinians, there has to be some prospect for a different outcome. So I don't know if that's different leadership, a different vision, a different strategy in terms of how we're going to get to a better outcome. But I don't think, even if it's not, high on the list of priorities, I don't think we can just wave it off the list of important things that need to be addressed in the Middle East. Even though many of these rulers in the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, other places, hopefully in the coming months and years will normalize relationships with Israel, a lot of the Arab street itself is not really reconciled to a new relationship. And I think that for really bringing Middle East societies along with these changes will require more action on the Palestinian front as well.
Thank you. Will, do you have a thought on it?
Sure. Look, the new leadership is needed in Palestine, and because can we trust? Abu Mazen does not have the juice that he once had. Who is the right successor? And you can't negotiate a broad deal unless you have a individual that everybody trusts can deliver. And so until that next level of leadership, is selected, identified, determined, I think seeing any future success on that issue is unlikely.
Suzanne, thank you, Will.
I'll just add the obvious, which is that any kind of normalization is a net positive for a region that has been riven by such conflict and such abnormal conditions of the impasse between states and peoples for so many years. But as Megan suggested and Will expanded upon, it doesn't resolve the core problem for the Palestinian people. And that has to be a priority, even as the administration is busy with many other issues and priorities. I'm heartened by the fact that our former colleague from Brookings, Hadi Amr, who's now over at the Department of State as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Israel-Palestine, is someone who really does understand the nature of the conflict and understands and has an excellent relationship with political actors on both sides of the conflict. And I hope that he will have some success in ensuring that we don't simply turn a blind eye to the ongoing situation for the Palestinian people. This is an important issue. And as you suggested, John, the longer we leave it unaddressed, the more difficult it gets to resolve.
Well, we'll probably hear some of that with the next speaker, Yair Lapid, who will be joining us to talk about how the Knesset sees the world and how the opposition now sees the world as well in Israel. I'm going to combine the next two questions. The first was about the absence, in many respects, of holding our Middle East friends, partners, adversaries accountable for human rights. The U.S. did not pursue aggressively human rights in the Middle East during the last administration, but this administration intends to embrace this in a very real way. And if it pushes certain countries too much on human rights, to what extent can they or will they begin to turn to China or Russia? Here we circle back with this great power relationship and dynamic. And which countries in the region, aside from the obvious U.S. adversaries like Iran or Syria, have already begun to show an interest in doing this? Let me go first to you, Suzanne, and then we'll go to Will and then Megan.
Look, I think it's absolutely fundamental that we uphold our values in pursuing our interests across the world. And that's especially true in the Middle East, where there has been a history of some sense among peoples of the region of rank hypocrisy, that we're deeply critical of Iran's violation of human rights and less critical of the violations by many of our allies. I see this administration adopting a much more balanced approach. It is often very difficult to criticize your allies publicly. Where I think we have seen U.S. officials have real impact is by ensuring that this is understood as a universal aspect of U.S. policy, and simply in their private conversations with individual leaders and representatives of partners and allies around the world, ensuring that we, in fact, raise these issues consistently. I know that was true for Condoleezza Rice when she was Secretary of State. Essentially, every time she met with anyone from the Middle East, irrespective with that country, she wanted to be sure that she was talking about the human rights situations, particularly where there were significant concerns. And so I think that as we routinize this, as we make it an important aspect of our policy, we don't have to open up a crisis or a conflict with every leadership. We simply hold them to the standards that we hold our adversaries to, and that will, over time, have an ameliorative effect.
Megan, your thoughts, please.
Yes, I agree completely with Suzanne here that we will see this administration raising these issues more systematically, and that will have an effect. This is not going to be new, as Suzanne said, to many of these countries, because previous administrations have taken this stance that what goes on inside a country is of interest and importance to the United States. And this is very different than the approach the Trump administration took in the last 4 years. One thing I would add on is the point that we're noting the 10-year mark of the Arab revolutions. And what is different about the Middle East today than 10 years ago? And I would say that it's hard to paint with a broad brush, but in many countries, there is a more active civil society for the United States to engage with. And that is something that America should do very robustly in trying to shore up, advocates of rights, of civil society, better standards for accountability, all of these things, which in the past might have proven or been viewed as a little bit threatening to the regimes in power. But I think there's a lot more to work with than there was 10 years ago. And I think that should be a significant part of how the Biden administration thinks about how it's going to underscore the support for our values in its Middle East policy. So it's not just raising issues with leaders, but it's also engaging with people in those societies. We've heard President Biden say on many occasions, it's not the example of power, but the power of our example. So there's also a whole element of how we need to demonstrate that we're willing to take a critical look at our own democracy. We're willing to analyze it and decide, hopefully collectively, what we need to do to shore up our institutions that have been under strain. I think that is also an important piece of being an advocate for democracy worldwide.
Will, let me come to you on a slightly separate question. I know you probably have something to add on that one, but this is a good one. Megan talked about this administration needing to do a little investment of calories with respect to Afghanistan, and I know that you've had a lot of experience on the ground there. What might you see as a shift of this administration with respect to Afghanistan and the agreement that it signed back in February of last year with the Taliban? We just had a major event last week here at Brookings on the future situation of women in Afghanistan if we see this peace agreement exercised on schedule. How might we see a shift? How might this administration shift from the current agreement that it has with the Taliban?
Sure. And to the previous question, briefly, the
Sure.
United States of America has become an exceptional nation, not because of what we have taken, but because of what we have given. And it's not just giving economic support, but it's also leadership and our values. And so if we're not maintaining our values, then that's a problem. Now I get criticized because I'm critical of my own party when we go away from our values, but we should hold ourselves, our friends, our family to higher standards. And so this is something that we should be able to do, and it can be done in a way that doesn't impact the relationship. But guess what? There is somebody else out there being like, hey, America's being unreasonable with you. Why don't you come with us? Because we don't care about that. That shouldn't deter us from still sticking to our values. When it comes to Afghanistan, which is fascinating, is that so this peace deal is not a peace deal. Okay, I've been against it. I've been against it. And when you still have the Taliban killing people and our allies, how is that stopping actions? Now, what's fascinating, this is kind of things are coming full circle. I was in Afghanistan when the Obama administration came in. The idea of talking to the Taliban under the Bush administration was an absolute no-go. That conversation really began with the Obama administration. And so the fact that we got to a point where we're engaging with the Taliban, and now folks that came from that administration are probably going to pull out, which I think they should. We're going to be in Afghanistan for a long time. And I think the things we need to be doing in Afghanistan is helping improve the Afghan Air Force so they can constantly have air superiority over the Taliban. We know they can be an effective fighting force. We need to educate the American people about how many resources and people are actually there. The loss of life and the amount of money that's being spent there is not as much as everybody thinks it is. Hey, guess what? We still have troops in Japan and Germany. We're not talking about pulling those kind of troops out.
And
so
Korea.
Let's stop. And Korea, yeah. So let's stop with the arbitrary timelines, and I hope that's what the administration does. And bottom line, we need to recognize, look, so when everybody, and you alluded to this, when everybody talks about, was it worth it? I was in the CIA before 9/11. And the feeling that everybody had on September 10th, before nervous about something was going to happen, then it happened, and then the worry about something else going to happen. The point of being in Afghanistan is preventing in a place where people can train, equip, and attack the homeland. That issue is always going to be something on the table. We have to commit resources to that region. Oh, and by the way, millions of girls are being educated over the last 10 years. That's what's going to help that country come out of the 5th century. And so we can get it right. We got to play a little bit tougher role. I think we got to start using the Jirga process a little bit better. We probably made some mistakes early on in how the original Constitution or the current Constitution was designed. Those are going to be some tough questions that the Biden administration is going to have.
We're running a little short on time. Megan, would you like to come in behind Will on this? And then we'll go around the horn very quickly with one final piece of advice that you'd like to offer to the Biden administration. So Megan, please.
Do you want me to come in on Afghanistan or on? Okay, so just briefly, I appreciate everything that Congressman Hurd said, and I do think that the right thing to do here would be to rejigger our approach towards Afghanistan. For all the things we can say about the February 2020 agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban, I think there's an agreement. This wasn't a peace accord. This was basically setting the stage for what was hoped to be an intra-Afghan dialogue. So that agreement, our withdrawal, including the full withdrawal on May 1st, is supposed to be conditions-based. And one of those conditions is bringing down violence. And another condition is engaging meaningfully in a dialogue with the Afghan government. And of course, the Taliban has not attacked the United States since that agreement was signed, but other levels of violence have gone up. And that is clearly not in the spirit of that February 2020 agreement. I was part of a congressionally mandated task force on Afghanistan chaired by General Joe Dunford and Senator Ayotte and Nancy Lindbergh. And we just came out with our report, and we really do encourage the Biden administration to say, look, the conditions have not been met for us to make this May 1st withdrawal. So we need to reset the expectations around our withdrawal and continue to try to see that this intra-Afghan dialogue can produce something, because this is the first time that the Taliban has talked to the Afghan government in this 20-year history. So, that is something we shouldn't let go quickly as well.
Thank you very much. And we are short of time. Let me just ask each one of you, if you have one piece of advice on the Middle East to offer this new administration, what would that be? Starting with you, Suzanne, please.
My advice is specific to Iran, but I think it applies to the entire region. As with most things, it's impossible to do to get policy that's right, that's fast, and that's cheap. You have to pick. The Biden administration really needs to focus on getting the policy right, not on doing it fast or doing it on the cheap.
Thank you. Will, please.
Be nice with nice guys and tough with tough guys, right? President Obama was nice with tough guys, and President Trump was tough with nice guys. Let's do it. Let's be nice with nice guys, tough with tough guys, and we'll be okay.
I'm going to get a transcript of that and post it next to my desk. And Megan O'Sullivan, please, last word.
I would, my advice would be, do not equate ending forever wars with withdrawing U.S. troops completely from the Middle East. That essentially, the ending forever wars is more a question of getting the right relationship between the US and our partners on the ground. And in many cases, we were really beginning to get there with a very, very modest US footprint that enabled host countries, and you know this, John, better than anyone else, enabling our indigenous partners to take the fight to where it needed to go. We don't talk about a forever war in the context of Japan or Germany or Korea, and we still have, as Congressman Hurd pointed out, a lot of troops on the ground, many, many more, 10 times more in Korea than we have in Afghanistan. So we need to not equate removing all of those troops with ending forever wars, that we have a different model that after 20 years of trying very hard and failing on many occasions, we have found a model that seems to be able to uphold our interest with a minimal physical commitment. And that, I think, is more in the US interest than simply being able to declare that all Americans are back at home.
Well, I can't thank you all enough for the wonderful vision that you've exposed us all to today, your thoughts. It's just wonderful conversation. Dr. Megan O'Sullivan, Brookings alum, welcome home. It's good to see you again. Congressman Will Hurd, great bipartisan leader in the Congress and a great leader within the CIA. It's wonderful to see you, sir. There's so much more service we need from you as well. And Vice President and Program Director Suzanne Maloney of the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Thank you all so much for joining us for this great opening panel of this conference. And we'll hear next from the Leader of the Opposition in the Knesset, Yair Lapid. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.